Greetings, friends of liberty. Not 3 weeks ago, I couldn't help but see as the carriage drew past Westminster Cathedral, a crowd of hundreds of lively worshippers noisily congregating near the entrance. Stopping the carriage, I asked Reeves to ascertain the cause of the tumult, such that it was, and he venturing forth soon discovered it. There were relics inside. An elbow of Thomas à Becket and segments of his pinky. Or so the faithful and their clerical masters would have us believe. And these two bony jangles comprised just a portion of the Anglican oddities, removed no doubt from some reliquary depository and now on tour. There were in addition the thigh bone of St. Cuthbert, the thigh bone having run of its own accord in terror of those dread pagans southward from Lindisfarne during the Viking invasions, finally finding sanctuary, at last, in Durham Cathedral with his longtime acquaintance there, St. Oswald, and the near-disintegrating scapula of St. Alban, his shoulder bone allegedly hailing from the 3rd century. It was all for me a very vivid reminder that, even in this age of reason, we find no end of souls eager to deceive themselves, to believe anything and everything, and very much encouraged to do so by the Church itself, which at the same time pretends to the highest morality, as if morality doesn't begin with the truth. Now, if we turn to the many instances of self-deception in your own 21st century, we find today an author of surpassing brilliance who has written a whole book on just this timeless phenomenon. I speak of Herbert Fingarette and self-deception. Our author, also having written, among others, the monograph Heavy Drinking, the Myth of Alcoholism as a Disease, and Confucius, the Secular is Sacred, in this book advances a radically new understanding of the practice that probably every human being who has ever lived, at least to the age of 5, has engaged in. It should be noted, incidentally, of those who believe self-deception just an aspect of psychopathology or merely a psychological phenomenon of limited applicability towards the social sciences, that this couldn't be more untrue. It is, to the contrary, of the highest import in understanding the highly destructive belief systems that have afflicted mankind since the dawn of time. Since the reality is that all ideologies are simply self-deceptive belief systems. Thus, an understanding of self-deception has vast relevance towards understanding the ideologies of Christianity, Islam, and all religions, nationalism, Nazism, and all forms of fascism, Marxism, communism, and all forms of socialism, racism, from that found in the Islamic world to Asia and around to the West, gender bias, such as the misogyny rife in earlier times to the misandry so prevalent today in the academy, and finally to the plethora of green ideologies increasingly colonizing the minds of our young people. Our author begins, in his very first sentence, by stating the ubiquity of the phenomenon. Were a portrait of man to be drawn, one in which there would be highlighted whatever is most human, be it noble or ignoble, we should surely place well in the foreground man's enormous capacity for self-deception. And soon he gives us a short definition of the self-deceiver, the one who lies with sincerity, who convinces himself of what even he, even then, knows is not so, who lies to himself and to others and believes his own lie, though in his heart he knows it is a lie. That is he. His book can be broken down into 3 main sections. In the first, he critically examines various theorists of self-deception. Let's do this now with him in his first chapter entitled To Believe or Not to Believe. Number 1. The idea of Harvard philosopher and Plato specialist Raphael Demos was that the self-deceiver believes what he knows to be false. The self-deceiver is blameworthy. What he does is wrong, and he knows that it is wrong. Demos also says that both the self-deceiver deliberately ignores contradictions, but also can, in a more offhand, distracted way, fail to notice them. Number 2. A variation on Demos is found in the philosopher Penelhum, whose criteria for self-deception are, number 1, belief in the face of strong evidence. Number 2, the subject's knowledge of the evidence. And number 3, the subject's recognition of the import of the evidence. So in other words, when a person knows that there is a strong evidence against one of his beliefs, but believes anyway. An interesting related case would be that of a mother who learns suddenly that her child has died, and because she is so shocked, has trouble initially believing it. Would this be an example of self-deception? Fingarette argues only in the case where, as time went on, she tried to convince herself unreasonably that the evidence was not strong, trying to deny it. In his next chapter entitled To Say or Not to Say, Fingarette argues that a common way of explaining and describing self-deception is by cognition-perception language. He says, it is quite natural to speak of the self-deceiver as one who doesn't perceive his own fakery, who can't see through the smokescreen he himself puts up, or sincerely believes the story he tells while deep inside him he knows it is not true. So language of perception and cognition. Fingarette suggests instead that a better approach would be by using the language of action and volition, and that such a shift is possible and for some purposes desirable. And this is partly because he believes and will argue that the act of self-deception is an active and purposeful one, and not passive as sight and belief often are. And so next, he does that. He uses the language of action and volition by introducing us to one of the most crucial elements of his theory, that of making something explicit or spelling it out. This is a skill and something active and purposeful. As Fingarette defines it, the specific skill I have in mind as a model for becoming explicitly conscious of something is the skill of saying what we are doing or experiencing. For example, we might have a feeling about another person, but we don't necessarily put it into words. But if a person asked us why we didn't like the person, we could attempt to make the reasons for our feeling explicit. Note that we can do anything. No, we can do this with anything. Explaining to another person our feeling why we think one team will beat another in the upcoming match. Explaining why you always make a complete and not rolling stop at this particular stop sign. Or why you've long hated Lady Gaga. Of course, with many or most things in life, we don't spell it out, otherwise we'd be talking all day and getting nothing done. And not spelling out is important to recognize, too, in a second element of the theory. As Fingarette says, the immediately crucial point is that we are not, in general, explicitly conscious of our engagements in the world, since we have no particular need to spell them out. Rather than taking explicit consciousness for granted, we must come to take its absence for granted. So not spelling out is our default mode. Now, having introduced these basic building blocks of his theory, he lays out precisely what he believes self-deception is, which is when there is overriding reason not to spell out some engagement, where we skillfully take account of this and systematically avoid spelling out the engagement. In other words, we avoid becoming explicitly conscious of our engagement, and B, we avoid becoming explicitly conscious that we are avoiding doing that. That, according to Fingarette, is self-deception. Now let's mention a few corollaries and then give an example. Number 1. A person obviously can only spell out for himself. Others can't do it for him. Number 2. Not spelling out becomes a habit in many cases because the person avoids making his values and engagements explicit over and over and over again. Number 3, the self-deceived person tends to be regarded by others as both sincere and as insincere. And this is because he tells us the same things he tells himself, the same story, but seems insincere when we realize his actions don't accord with his statements. Number 4, the person has the tendency or motivation to spell out falsely so as to cover the real reasons he doesn't spell out. So, for example, a paranoid person doesn't say that he feels hostility to others. No, he says that they are all out to get him. So what would be a real-life example that incorporates all these aspects? Hitler. So Hitler resented Jews and their success. As a soldier in World War I, he believed the false notion and conspiracy theory that Jews and capitalists stabbed the army and nation in the back, which he believed led to Germany's defeat. So instead of being able to express his own actual engagement, as Fingarette would say, instead of being able to spell out his envy and the reality that the Jews weren't to blame for Germany's defeat, the country simply being exhausted from so many years of struggle, he instead imagined the Jews as both powerful and evil, thus engaging in a false spelling out. So he didn't have to spell out the unpleasant realities of his own failed life, his envy of the Jews, and the real reasons for Germany's defeat. Fingarette, also understanding the importance of examples as he does throughout the book, proceeds to give us examples of self-deception from literature, starting with Molière to Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh, but I won't go into those here. Now you might think the theory is complete, but not quite. Now he introduces a final ethical component in the chapter entitled To Avow or Not to Avow, as when taking a marriage vow. So he asks, why do indeed spell out anything? Well, he says that we can see why when we see why people do not spell out things when they should. So if a person asked a husband, are you married to this woman? And he refused to spell it out, to avow it, to own it, then it could certainly be because he wants to deny this specific commitment, this engagement in the world to this woman. Fingarette elaborates on this crucial point by saying, understanding self-deception as disavowal reveals at last the fundamental answer to our question. Why is it so important not to spell out certain aspects of our engagement in the world? And that's because internally, he believes, we can then disavow or disown them. So, for example, a person may be angrily say that he is not angry, or may reveal his worried state even while disavowing worry or concern. So here, the person is spelling out or describing very precisely that he's worried or angry, or what he's worried or angry about, while disowning or disavowing the feeling as his itself, because he wants to deceive himself about or deny his own anger or worry and what it might mean if he is angry. One final corollary that Fingarette notes is that when people are playing a role, pretending to be something that is false, like an employee pretending to like his boss when he really hates his guts, there will be a certain artificiality and lack of genuineness in his performance, a tendency to overdo and ham it, a certain insensitivity to the subtleties peculiar to the situation, a stereotypy in manner. From this point on, for the rest of the book, Fingarette compares and contrasts his theory with those of the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, and the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. I'll refrain from spelling out his treatment of these because I think it would involve lots of work with little additional reward, but would just mention in passing Sartre's concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, which is when people aren't into something and just go through the motions. This is seen often in people who won't commit to a specific value, activity, or engagement in their life, either temporarily or permanently, so they don't do it authentically, they do it in bad faith. In conclusion, I love this book. This is philosophy at its best. I'd give it an A minus. While Fingarette uses descriptive and precise language throughout, he avoids academic jargon, writes in the older style accessible to the educated layman, and leads us instructively with examples along the elements of his theory. Whether or not his theory is true or true in every respect, it's a brilliant attempt to elucidate the nature of this fundamental aspect of human behavior lying at the border of psychology and ethics. Very happy for my part that I shall now adjourn to the bedroom down the hall, first to spell out in great detail and to avow to Marguerite my love for her, which women enjoy greatly and which leads them in their happiness to also spelling out and avowing their love for you. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.